Grandfather clocks used to be a part of many households, but now we often think of them as loud jump scare machines for horror movies. They still have a vintage appeal to them, we say. Besides the fact that every grandfather clock is an antique at this point, their inner mechanisms are fascinating to look at. In this video, we're going to show you how carefully crafted and considered the insides of a grandfather clock can be. As tall as grandfather clocks are, most of the mechanism is located in the top, behind the dial. The top portion of a grandfather clock is like the entirety of a watch. You have the face of the watch, and almost everything that drives it is built into the compartment directly behind it. In the middle portion, there's just the pendulum mechanism. It's easy to underestimate the pendulum, but it really is the beating heart of the clock. And we'll see later on in the video, the back and forth motion of the pendulum is what makes the clock tick. That's basically all there is to it. The base of the clock will usually be densely made in order to keep the clock from tipping over, but there's no mechanism inside. Anything else is just for show. But first, we need to understand the very basic that a clock needs to be able to do. For any time-keeping device, the most basic thing it needs to be able to track is a second. If a clock or a watch can count a second, you can easily design a mechanism that counts 60 seconds as a minute and 60 minutes as an hour. Different types of mechanisms have different ways to figure out what a second is. Quartz watches, which are the most common type of non-smartwatch, use quartz crystal to produce electrical signals, and a controller to derive a second from the signal. Mechanical watches of the olden days used the unwinding of mainspring to turn a gear train inside the watch. For grandfather clocks, it's the pendulum that produces the seconds. Now, let's look at the magic of the pendulum. In grandfather clocks, and pendulum clocks in general, the swingy thing in the middle is where the clock tracks seconds. Invented in 1656, this pendulum system is essentially a harmonic oscillator. That's just a cool term for a device that's designed to swing at a very precise interval. In the 1600s, Galileo discovered something interesting about how pendulums work. He observed that a pendulum will always take the exact same amount of time to swing from one peak to the other. That might not make sense at first, because surely the pendulum would stop at some point, but the trick is that as a pendulum loses speed, it swings slower, but the overall cycle will always take the same amount of time to complete. You can see how the constant speed of a pendulum can be used to determine a second. Although this system was invented in the mid-1600s, its precision as timekeeper was unmatched all the way till the 1930s. You could say that the pendulum swung the entire world through the Industrial Revolution, and horology as we know it wouldn't be the same if it never existed. In fact, when it comes to accuracy, pendulums are second only to quartz. Mechanical watches, whether they went on your wrist or in your pocket, were definitely a compromise of accuracy for portability. These watches can still be inaccurate enough to lose or gain up to half a minute every day. As for pendulums, they can stay accurate to within a minute per month. No sweat. We're tempted to go on a tangent about how the old ways were the best and all these kids need to get off our lawn. Next, how did these clocks get the power to run? We'll now venture upwards into the top of the clock, where the rest of the mechanism is located. This part of the clock will sound familiar if you've ever looked at the inside of a mechanical watch, because the concept is relatively the same. There are two sets of gears that make up the gear train of a grandfather clock. You have a set of power gears and a set of timekeeping gears. The power gears give energy to the timekeeping gears, which are responsible for driving the handset. Let's look at the power gears first. These gears have a weight attached to them that hangs downwards. The pull of gravity on this weight is what turns the gears, but these are big stinking gears that aren't precise enough for the finer work of telling the time. Now, this weight can only fall so far naturally, and once it reaches its lowest point, it'll stop giving power to the gears. That's when someone has to come along and wind up the clock. In the pre-quartz days, every timekeeping mechanism needed to be wound in some way. Here, when you wind the clock, clock, you're basically pulling the weight back to its starting position, where it can begin to fall again. The clock can only tell time for as long as the weight is moving down, so this time period can be referred to as its power reserve. Pendulum clocks like this normally have power reserves of a couple of days, though the heavier the weight and gears, the longer the power reserve. Finally, let's turn to those timekeeping gears. Like we said, the power gears are too big and heavy to do something as precise as telling the time, so their job is to turn the set of timekeeping gears. The timekeeping gears are connected by their teeth to the power gears, and they, in turn, are connected to the handset. As they turn, they move the second hand around the face of the clock, but the hand has to tick forward exactly once every second. That's where the pendulum comes in. You might think that the pendulum has a direct link to the timekeeping gears, but it actually doesn't. Instead, there's an escapement wheel that spins under the force provided by the pendulum. It's the spin of the escapement that regulates the speed of the timekeeping gears, and thus allows the timekeeping gears to move the seconds hand correctly. Beyond that, there are other mechanisms in the handset that allow the minute to tick forward every time the seconds hand completes a circle of the dial. And there's a similar system that ticks the hour hand when the minute hand completes its path around the dial. There you have it. This is how a pendulum clock tells the time. Does this mean you should go out and buy a grandfather clock? You totally could. There's no reason why you shouldn't, really. You will have to deal with winding the clock from time to time, but that's easy enough to do, and you won't be doing it as often as you would with a mechanical watch. Is there a reason to seek out a grandfather clock? Not really. If you find a really nice one at a thrift shop or antique store, it can bring an old-fashioned flair to your interior decor. Many people like to own grandfather clocks simply because they appreciate the engineering and design that went into their clockwork hearts. The great thing about these clocks is that the internal mechanisms are so simple that they're easy to repair. There's no reason why a clock that chills in a particular spot of your house should ever break down. But if you do find an antique that's seen better days, any watchmaker should be able to fix it up. In fact, you could make it a DIY project for yourself. If you are starting your hunt for a grandfather clock though, here are some things to keep in mind. First off, price. Antiques can be worth some money simply due to their heritage, but you really shouldn't be breaking the bank on these things. With that out of the way, to be on the safe side, you want to avoid clocks with pendulums that hang off of metal rods. The time a pendulum takes to swing from side to side depends on the weight of the pendulum and the length of the rod. While the weight isn't ever going to change, a metal rod will expand and contract based on temperature. So you might end up with a clock whose accuracy changes with the weather. A metal rod isn't an instant deal breaker for grandfather clocks. Some of the later clocks had systems in place to compensate for the changing length of the rod. But is that really something you want to get into for what's really a pretty frivolous purchase? Stay on the safe side and avoid metal rods. Now, all that is assuming that you're planning on actually using your grandfather clock to keep time. Let's face it, the world's #1 timekeeping device right now is a smartphone. You might be one of those people who uses their phone to check the time, even with a watch on your wrist. If you have no functional use for a grandfather clock, then get whichever one you can find. That's it for this video. Do you own a grandfather clock? If you do, was it a thrift find or a family heirloom? Post your answers in the comments section below, and don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have down there as well. But whatever you do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.